Hi everybody, Jorge here, and today I want to talk about rationalization of trauma. So, rationalization of trauma is this pernicious, pervasive, increasingly common phenomenon in our culture that has bothered me a lot over the years. And it bothered me because I saw it everywhere. I heard it in my social circles, I heard it in the media, I heard it from the mouths of politicians, I heard a lot of it in church. And it bothered me that much, not just because I saw the logical fallacy in this whole rationalization rhetoric, but also because I saw very tangible and practical consequences that rationalization of trauma implies, especially in contexts related to social justice. And the thing is, as much as I saw it, I still couldn't talk about it in a meaningful way because I didn't have the word for it. You know, in research they say, the moment you can name the problem, you can start addressing it effectively. And this is 100% true. We have to be able to put some language, to put some word, to put some term to a problem, to a pressing problem, in order to be able to have conversations about it in a meaningful way. And so I, with my heart, every time I encountered rationalization of trauma, I felt how wrong that was, and I just felt intuitively how damaging and how dangerous this line of thinking was, because I saw the consequences of it, but I didn't have the term for it, and I only discovered that term quite recently. 2 years ago, basically, when I started studying empathy and failures of empathy, not just in individual relationships, the way I had done it for years before, but when I started studying that in big intersectional contexts related to social justice, in historical contexts, in collective contexts, I started studying situations where not just one person denied empathy to another person, but when failures of empathy happened on a collective, historical level, between the groups of people who held privilege and then the groups of people who were oppressed. And basically that year there were many events that drove me into that part of my research, because there were so many things happening at the same time. In my personal journey, in my journey with my book, with my creative project, I encountered so many empathic failures, basically on the part of people who professed abundance of empathy and who portrayed themselves as empathy gurus, like social equality champions. But in fact, when the conversation got real, there were total failures of empathy around my work, around my personal story. And then, it was this big contextualization of this personal experience, because that year there were so many events happening. There were Me Too stories coming out, and I saw the reactions of people to those stories that were not supportive, that were not empathetic, that were not kind of based on critical thinking and critical awareness. Then there were concentration camps for gay men in Russia, the country where I live in, and how people reacted to that news here in this country and around the world, which was also, for the most part, empathic failure. Then there were those natural calamities that struck the south of the U.S. and many countries in the Caribbean, and then the response of the U.S. federal government, and also how people talked about that in social media. So all of that gave me a lot of food for thought, to think about why we have so little empathy in our culture, like what gets in the way of empathy in those collective contexts related to social justice. Because I already, by that moment, I had already understood what got in the way of empathy in individual relationships, most common barriers to empathy, and how to basically work our way through them. And I wanted also to understand what got in the way of empathy in those larger historical collective contexts. And so when I started studying that, I basically came across this term in the literature, rationalization of trauma, because it turned out, like, that was really mind-blowing for me. It turned out that those very barriers to empathy that sabotage empathy in individual relationships are also things that sabotage empathy in our collective context, absolutely the same. So, Brene Brown has a great video about that. I will put a link in the description below where she talks about our shields, the ways in which we armor up against empathy, against practicing empathy with someone. And so she talks about most common ways, most common barriers to empathy, such as sympathy, blame, trivialization, rationalization, stereotyping, one-upping. It is also a common barrier when we kind of override another person's story with our story instead of really trying to understand their experience and be present with them in their experience. And when it comes, those are the ways to deny empathy in individual relationships. But when it comes to those collective historical contexts, to those contexts related to social justice and, common dimensions of injustice and inequality, such as racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, the most common way to deny people empathy around this kind of trauma is what? It is rationalization. And so these days, I absolutely believe that rationalization of trauma is worth having a conversation about because it is very common and because we pay a huge cost for it. Basically anything that gets in the way of social justice is deserving of a conversation because, social justice, it's not just about kind of morality, spirituality issues. Social justice has very, very tangible, very observable and measurable economic consequences because any kind of systemic oppression inevitably results in the waste of human potential. And then we all have to pay for that economic loss for the money that we could have collectively produced and we don't produce because of those kinds of injustice. And so if you believe that you're not affected by injustice because you hold privilege, you believe you're not affected by racism because you're white, or you're not affected by sexism because you're male, you're not affected by homophobia because you're straight, that is a freaking myth. You're still affected because our society as a whole is affected through those large economic mechanisms. So we all pay a cost for social injustice. And so anything that blocks our journey towards social justice, towards fairness and equality and equity and all those values that, democracies are built upon, any of those barriers deserve having conversations about, especially when they are so common and so deeply embedded in our culture and the rhetoric that we use on a daily basis. So let's talk about rationalization of trauma today. And, I want to start with a definition. In many of my videos, I start by giving definitions, and that is not because, I wanted to lecture somebody, because I want to put myself in this position of kind of smart ass researcher. That is not the case. I'm not basically smarter than anybody else. And everything that I know because of my curiosity. I know because of digging into research. And, I'm also not a professional researcher. I'm not a kind of academic researcher of social science. I'm an artist. And I do this research as a function of my artistic work because I want to better understand the issues that I address in my creative work, in my creative storytelling. And so social justice is one of those values. This is the value that was really deep in my heart since, the time I remember myself. It has been there. And so I want, one of the ways in which I see my artistic mission, and my life's purpose is to make the world a better place, promoting social justice, talking about social justice in a meaningful and an effective way, and doing that through my art, which is, quite an effective way of doing this work. That's not the only way of doing social justice work, but this is one of the of those effective ways. Because through art, we can basically overcome our differences in perspective taken and bring about more empathy and connect people that are different, that have different perspectives. We can connect them to those universally relatable emotions and those universally relatable experiences because, basically, what better than art can bring you closer to the people you believe you hate and show you their humanity in such a frustrating way that your hate is defeated at its core. What better than art can call bullshit on everything that happens to the world that isn't truant and kind? So I'm quoting Brene Brown here, and she is so profoundly right. And so, I started researching these topics quite recently in my life, but I learned a lot of valuable knowledge, and these days I want to share that knowledge with as many people as I possibly can, both through my art and also through my real life conversations and through the conversations that I facilitate, the conversations that I lead, through my kind of community work. And here's the thing, I really like to start this conversation, this hard and tough and uncomfortable conversations about social justice with definitions. And the reason is because a lot of conflict and a lot of misunderstanding and also a lot of empathic failure results from us using the same words but meaning different things. So that's the thing. That's why starting with definitions makes sense, because a lot of unnecessary conflict results from us just having different definitions of the same terms. So I've seen a lot of it in my conflict transformation work over the years. So it is really important that when we go into these conversations, we are crystal clear about what it is that we're talking about. So that's why when I talk about these concepts that can be, interpreted ambiguously, I really like starting with. I like to start with those clear-cut, no BS, transparent definitions that allow us to be clear, and instead of going into that unnecessary conflict just because we use different language for the same terms, or use the same language for different terms, for different concepts. Instead of that, we can focus on having a productive and meaningful conversation. So the definition of rationalization of trauma for me starts with the definition of trauma. And what is trauma? You can hear this word a lot being thrown around. You can also see a lot of it in the literature applied, in very different contexts. And the definition of trauma, I basically came up with my own definition of trauma that emerged from my own data. Those interviews of people that I've been leading over the years with people who survived different kinds of trauma and how they talked about their trauma. This is basically the same approach that Brene Brown uses in her research, the grounded theory approach, this kind of methodology where we don't start with any kind of hypothesis, but our theories and our models and our concepts, they emerge from lived experiences of people that we interview. And so this definition of trauma that emerged for me and that I'm using these days to lead in these conversations is this. It's quite simple. Trauma is a negative adverse situation that happens for no fault of an individual or a group of people and happens totally beyond our control. And that is neurobiologically perceived and neurobiologically experienced as a threat to survival or a basic human need. So here you have it. With the way, the reason why I like this definition is because it is very practical and very useful. With this definition, you can see those three qualifying parameters that are required to be able to see someone's experience as trauma. First, it's a negative situation. Second, it happens for no fault of their own, beyond any control of their own. And third, it is neurobiologically perceived, literally chemically experienced as a threat to survival or a basic human need. So with this definition, it becomes easy to understand that trauma is not just those big things like war or genocide. You don't actually need to live in the military conflict zone in order to become traumatized. But trauma is a multitude and a diversity of things that we come across on a daily basis. So for example, with this definition, it becomes easy to understand why joblessness can be experienced as trauma. Because if you're, for example, in the US in 2008 amid this ongoing economic recession, and then you lose your job, so it happens for no fault of your own, it's a negative adverse situation. And then you wake up the next morning after getting laid off, realizing that you're not going to get a new job anytime soon because of this ongoing macroeconomic situation. And then, like many Americans, maybe you don't have a significant amount of money in your savings account. And so you think, how am I going to make my food budget next month? How am I going to make my rent next month or my mortgage payment next month? So, is that trauma? Yes, that is trauma. Because having food on your table and having a roof over your head are among your basic human needs. And when those needs are threatened by some situation that happens beyond your control, that is experienced as trauma, of course. Another example here, kind of more complex thing here, poverty. In America, people hate to talk about poverty. They tend to kind of see it as a minority problem, especially the one we know from, the last census that was in 2010, that, like in America, poor population comprised 16% of the population. So technically, that's a minority. So it's easy to kind of look at that problem as a minority problem and dismiss it, to treat it as a problem of minor significance because of that. But let me tell you, 16% of the population living in poverty is a disproportionate amount for the wealthiest nation in the world and for a Western democracy. That's a disproportionate amount of people. And even more, if you look deeper at the same data, it turns out that the poverty metric used in that census was basically very humble and very moderate and not very relevant to our current socioeconomic context. So when we apply a more valid poverty metric, we get 30% of people living in poverty or on the brink of poverty in the US, in the wealthiest nation of the world. And even more shockingly, about 75% of Americans are expected to live in poverty for at least 1 year in their lives. So that is what looks like a minority problem on the surface. It's not. And also, there's this cultural kind of misconception of poverty because, if you're middle class or if you're upper middle class or if you're wealthy and I start talking to you about poverty, you kind of say, but Jorge, that is not trauma. Poverty is not trauma because those people, they're just lazy. They don't want to go get a job. Like in the US, there's a lot of economic opportunity. They just don't want to go get a job. So they are to blame for their own poverty. It doesn't qualify as trauma. And let me tell you, that is a very convenient position when you are, the beneficiary of privilege, of class privilege, when you're middle class or wealthy. But poverty is far bigger than not getting a job. And before you tell me about that, I have to inform you that according to the data from that very census that I mentioned earlier, the majority of the poor population in the U.S. are employed, either part-time or full-time. And that doesn't solve their poverty. Poverty is this complex socioeconomic phenomenon that sometimes lasts for generations. So it cannot be solved by just telling people to go get a job. And also, among the remainder of the poor population of the people who do not work, the majority are children or the elderly, people who cannot work. So those kind of mythical, lazy people with a victim mentality who just kind of want to live on social welfare, they are basically a minority of the poor population. And so poverty cannot be solved that way. But how poverty is experienced? It is experienced exactly as trauma. Because when you find yourself, wondering where your next meal is going to come from, when you're living in food insecurity, when you're living without access to healthcare, that, all those things threaten your basic human needs. So that is experienced as trauma. And, even kind of even worse. If you look at the rest of the world, if you don't just look at the US or the developed country, but if you look at the rest of the world, the situation around poverty is still more glaring. So, for example, I live in Russia. I was born here, I grew up here, lived my entire life here. And in this country, 80% of the population are poor. It's not 18, it's 80, the overwhelming majority of the population. And I am, I graduated from this country's oldest and largest medical school. I have almost 10 years of clinical experience behind my belt. I have worked in private institutions, public institutions, part-time, full-time, and I'm still poor. There is no way for me to get out of poverty, and it's not because I'm lazy, it's not because I'm not motivated enough, or it's not because I'm not intelligent enough or not hardworking enough. I have a diploma with highest distinction. I could work my ass off during many years. But the thing is that I cannot get out of poverty because of the amount of economic opportunity that exists here. Like, it's in the third world countries, the amount of economic opportunity is tiny. So if I work part-time here in healthcare here in Russia, I will get about $100 a month. And I know that sounds like an unlivable amount for you in the Western world, but this is what we get here. And then if I work full-time, I get about $400 a month. So this is how narrow the window of economic opportunity is. And no matter how hard you work, no matter how talented you are, no matter how hardworking you are, you cannot get out of poverty. You cannot get even into middle class life, even with a university education, even when you're a doctor or a lawyer or a college professor. And so that is why. But is poverty experienced as trauma? Yes, of course it is. And I've been growing up with this trauma, and I've been living in that trauma for the majority of my life. I only remember about six months in my life. It was in 2013 when it was a period of relative kind of economic stability, when I first started having some discretionary income, which is the hallmark of middle class life. But then again, it's been poverty. And so every month, I'm not sure about how am I going to make my food budget next month. I live without access to adequate healthcare, even though I am myself a healthcare worker. If my car breaks, that's not a new car, that's not a good car, but it's the only vehicle that I have. And if it breaks, like if I need some, minor replacement, like replace a battery in my car, I will have to cut on my food next month. So this is my lived life experience. And before you tell me that poverty is, the fault of those people who are poor, my story is a reality check for that. It's not. It's not the case in the majority of the world, and it's not the case even in developed countries like the US. And so basically this kind of economic situation is one of the reasons why I've been seeking for 7 years now. I've been seeking to find an opportunity to move away and to start over in the Western world. And then again, this kind of immigration enterprise requires a budget that I don't have, like many of my privileged university friends. They had it, and they successfully immigrated from Russia, and they're now very well off in the US and Spain and Austria, in many Western countries. But I couldn't do that because I didn't have the money to basically do all the stuff around the notarization of my diploma, then prep courses, then medical exams in the West, and it requires the kind of expense that I would never be able to pay for myself. No matter where I work, no matter how hard I work, I cannot just accumulate this money with the amount of economic opportunity present in this country. So poverty is trauma. And also another thing that comes to mind for me here, the kind of situation that endangers people's basic human needs is Flint water crisis. By the way, it's ongoing. It's not in the past. But when the information broke out, and I started listening to many podcasts and many interviews of people who were there, they talked about their experience as trauma, because it was trauma. When you wake up in the morning and you think, how am I going to make my morning coffee? How am I going to brush my teeth? How am I going to shower? How am I going to make lunch for my kids? Is that water safe? Access to tap water, basic human need. And then you live in the wealthiest nation of the world, and then you learn that this water is poisoned. And of course, this entire situation had a very clear racial connotation, because the majority of the population of Flint were black, and they were governed by white people. And then, before you tell me, but Jorge, they could go get bottled water. Not everybody could go get bottled water. Some people didn't have a vehicle. Some people were physically disabled. And bottled water is not a meaningful replacement for tap water. And so, unless people had the opportunity to move out of the area, which again, not everybody had, they were staying there, they experienced trauma. That was quintessential trauma. Another example that comes to mind for me is rape. Why do rape survivors talk about their experience as trauma? Because our physical safety is a birthright, and it is kind of hard-coded in our brain that this is a non-negotiable boundary. And so until we go through this horrible experience of physical violence or sexual violence, we take it for granted. We take our physical safety for granted. And then this boundary gets violated by the experience that happens for no fault of our own. And so rape survivors are, they have depression and PTSD in a pretty much the same way as military veterans have that, because their basic human need got endangered by this situation. And so that was trauma. That was real trauma. And, of course, systemic kinds of injustice and oppression, like racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, Islamophobia, whatever that is, they are experienced as trauma by people who are being targeted, because what these kinds of discrimination do is they threaten people's inherent human worth and their belonging in society. So, as a social species, we are hardwired for connection and belonging, and this is a basic human need, again. So anything that tells you that you're not worthy of belonging in society, of being accepted, of being treated as equal, of being treated fairly because of who you are, that is experienced on a neurobiological, literally chemical level as trauma. And so when we see someone's story of trauma, or when we hear someone's story of trauma, the right way to respond to it is what? Empathy. And what is empathy? Empathy is not saying, oh, you're a poor thing, I feel so sorry for you, with a big trailer, with a big parenthetical, but I'm happy that I'm not you. That is sympathy. That's not empathy. And so empathy is basically recognizing the emotional experience of another person and then connecting to the same experience within ourselves. And then communicating that back. Communicating that we have connected with the same experience. So when someone comes to me in joy or in love, or they're excited, they're passionate about something, they have a new dream, then my job when it comes to empathy is to recognize that experience and then to connect with the same experience within me. And then feel it along with them and communicate that back. Pretty much the same way when someone comes to me in grief or abandonment, loneliness, shame, scarcity, any of those dark emotions, my job is to identify that and to connect with the same emotion within me. in order to be present with them in theirs. And so this basically explains why trauma is such a hard thing to practice empathy around, because as we know from the definition, trauma is experienced as a threat to survival or a basic human need. And so even if we had such an experience, even if we know what it feels like, connecting with that experience within ourselves is extremely painful. It's extremely uncomfortable. So what happens instead, very often, is when that person comes to us and tells us their story of trauma, shares their traumatic experience, what we start doing is we start rationalizing. So what is rationalizing? We convince ourselves and that person that their trauma happens for some good reason, for some greater purpose, for some higher purpose, for some divine reason. In church they may tell you, oh, you suffer so much, but that is why you will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Or your friends may tell you, you know what, that person treated you really badly, but that is why you're such a kind person to others. Or people might tell you, you should be grateful to those who abused you and betrayed you and manipulated you and cheated on you, because they taught you those important lessons about boundaries. And of course, any of that is bullshit. It is a bullshit driven by comfort, because people don't want to empathize, they want to stay comfortable, and empathizing with your trauma requires them to go out of their comfort zone, and so they deny your experience and also manipulate you into denying your own experience. And so why does this happen? Given that we see that so often in politics, in church, even in our families, even in our friendships, why does rationalization of trauma happen? Is it because there are bad people? Do people give you rationalization instead of empathy because they're mean, because they want to hurt you? Rationalization of trauma hurts. It always hurts because it's not empathy. Anytime you reach out and open up and kind of make that bid for connection, make that bid for empathy, and instead you receive anything that is not empathy, sympathy, rationalization, trivialization, stereotyping, that hurts. That is profoundly shaming. People turn your vulnerability into shame when they respond like that. But why does it happen? Is it because they want to hurt you? Is it because they're stupid people? Is it because they're insensitive people? No. It's just because their need for comfort is bigger than their respect for truth. So this is where it boils down to. It's about what is bigger, their respect for truth or their need for comfort. And in my experience, the majority of people opt for comfort. And this is not surprising because we have this culture that is obsessed with comfort. Like when you grow up, how many times are you told, what, truth is important, honesty is important, we need to be able to lead uncomfortable conversations. No. We are taught to stay comfortable. Comfort is our highest priority growing up. This is how we are culturally conditioned. And so when this kind of culture conspires with our reptilian brain, whose function is to protect us from any discomfort, then we get this result. If comfort is your absolute top priority, you're gonna suck at empathy. And you know what? Empathy and comfort are mutually exclusive when it comes to practicing empathy around experiences of trauma. But also, even if you need to practice empathy around some positive emotional experiences, the experiences of joy, or being in love, or having a dream, or being inspired or excited, that also requires you to go out of your comfort zone, because joy is the most vulnerable emotion. So, comfort absolutely sabotages empathy, and it happens subconsciously. Like before you even know it, your reptilian brain, it starts feeling like you start hearing that trauma story, and since we're all social species, since we have that capacity for empathy, unless you're a clinical sociopath, like we have that capacity for empathy. The majority of people have that capacity, but the moment they start feeling that discomfort, that experience of having their survival, their human need threatened, which is exactly what is empathy about trauma feels like. This very moment, our reptilian brain sends the signal to our prefrontal cortex. No. Disengage, build a wall, and start rationalizing. So rationalization happens here. It happens in the prefrontal cortex because the reptilian brain, it's quite ancient evolutionarily. It cannot make up plausible stories, but our prefrontal cortex can. But it's driven with this emotional signal from our reptilian brain. And, this kind of phenomenon, where our need for comfort absolutely sabotages empathy, critical awareness, and even our integrity, is so much visible, is so readily visible when empathy needs to be practiced across some big dimensions of inequality, across those dimensions where privilege and disadvantage can be readily seen and observed. So those are the dimensions of gender, race, class, sexual orientation. For example, when someone, when a person of color comes to me and they tell me a story and they share with me an experience of being confronted with institutionalized racism, because people of color grew up with this chronic trauma of racism. Racism is deeply embedded in our culture. But then this person comes to me with some particular experience. Maybe they had it in their educational institution, in their workplace, or, even in a grocery store. Racism is something you come across on a daily basis as a person of color. And then I listen to their experience and I say, wow, that sounds like a horrible story. But you know what? I don't see it that way. I see it differently. I think you were laid off not because you were black, but because you probably showed up late to work a few times, so your boss just didn't like you. Pretty much the same way, when a woman comes to me and she shares with me some particularly female experiences of maybe being objectified or, some experiences of misogyny, and then I tell her, you know what, that really sounds like a horrible story, but I don't think it was really like that. I don't think that there was any sexual harassment in that comment that your boss made or in that treatment that you got somewhere. So here's the thing. I react that way because, I may react that way. And I did react that way many times over my life, unfortunately, because when that person comes to me, their story of trauma effectively confronts me about my privilege. So that's the thing. We all have privilege. We all have some unearned advantages in different areas of life. There is no such thing as an absolutely underprivileged person. Those lotteries play out independently, so we all have privilege in some area of life. And so when someone comes to us and their story confronts us about our privilege, what is the go-to emotion, the default emotion that we feel? Let me explain this, because I also studied privilege for quite a long time, and there are 4 functions of privilege, the 4 ways in which it commonly manifests. And the first function of privilege, the most common way, is when I have privilege, I can afford to live without any awareness about it. I can walk through life with this invisible backpack of advantages and assume that everybody has the same rights, the same freedoms, the same opportunity, the same access, the same power, the same authority as I have, even when that's glaringly not the case. So I'm culturally conditioned to not see injustice. and to not see inequality when I have privilege. And so that applies to any kind of privilege. White privilege, male privilege, heterosexual privilege, any kind of privilege. And so when their story, when that person's story confronts me about my privilege, even though they don't have any shaming or aggressive intention, they're just sharing what happened to them, and they're making a bid for empathy and for connection. But their experience effectively confronts me about my privilege. And so, the emotion that people go for so often is what? It is shame. So I start feeling like I'm a bad person because I have those advantages that this person doesn't have. And, it happens in a split second before you know it. And shame happens in the reptilian brain. It's quite a primitive emotion. And even though it's completely absurd, because how can I be ashamed about something that I get as a result of randomness? But it effectively, this kind of shame storm happens. And it happens, especially in the American culture, because American culture revolves a lot around this myth of meritocracy, that everything we have is what we have earned, what we have worked for, what we have deserved. So this myth of meritocracy is completely fatal to critical awareness. And so when I am kind of raised in this culture of meritocracy, then everything that exposes my blind spots, everything that exposes my unearned advantages, and basically opens my eyes to the fact that many of the things, many of the aspects of success I have in life do not result from my own effort or from my own work, but from something that I started with and other people didn't start with. That triggers shame, effectively. I can tell you for sure, I've seen it so many times, both in my personal journey, talking to American people who were much more privileged than I was, socioeconomically, and, but this can happen across any dimension, race, class, gender, orientation. And so when that happens, when we start feeling shame around our privilege, before we know it, shame drives three communicative behaviors: denial, blame, rationalization. So instead of acknowledging the truth of that person's experience, I start denying, rationalizing, or blaming. So that's why rationalization of trauma is so common. It's because people who have power and privilege in our society want to erase those stories of trauma that are created by systemic injustice and inequality, because they live on the upside of that inequality. It's not 100% correct, because, as I told you earlier, we're all affected by inequality, even if we have privilege. But it's comfortable to think that, this problem doesn't really bother me because I am white, or I am male, or I am straight, or I am Christian, or I am middle class. But in fact, we're all affected by it. But in order to make ourselves comfortable with our ignorance about our privilege, to make ourselves comfortable with our kind of meritocracy belief system, we go and erase other people's lived experiences, because those people are different from us. And so this is 100% visible when it comes to privilege and disadvantage in those big dimensions. And also, the solution to it, the solution that I found working for myself, is we need to seek conscious awareness about our privilege. We need to actively seek it. It's not the kind of awareness that will ever be acquired passively by osmosis or, somehow absorbed from what we see around ourselves. No, we need to actively seek it. We need to actively seek out opportunities to talk to people that are different from us, and to listen and believe and accept their experiences exactly as they tell them to us. That is perspective taking, one of those skills that inform empathy. So we need to seek out those opportunities, and that's uncomfortable. That takes a lot of our emotional bandwidth, but that allows us to be critically aware and truthful, and to be able to become part of the change instead of remaining part of the problem. So unless we wrap our heads around our privilege, and that's a lifetime of learning. You can never know enough about our privilege because, according to the first function of privilege, when I have privilege, I can live without its awareness. I can live in ignorance. And so there's always something new to learn because our blind spots are in our aspects of privilege that may be not so readily visible as gender, race, but we have many, many advantages that we are still not aware of. And in order to become aware of those advantages, we have to listen to the stories of people who don't have those advantages. This is how reality checks happen. And this is how our level of self-awareness and critical awareness goes up. And there's never a limit to that. We are at our most dangerous when we believe that we know already enough about our privilege and that everything that we have other than what we have learned is due to our effort. This is the fourth function of privilege, and this is very dangerous. So we need to keep learning about it and keep listening to other people's stories and acknowledging their stories when they're different from us, and acknowledging that the world they see through their eyes is every bit as real and honest as truthful as the world we see through ours. And also when it comes to rationalization, I think every culture has its own language, like its own terms around this rationalization rhetoric. But in Hispanic cultures, we have this particularly common phrase. I repeated it a lot growing up, thinking that it would make me more mature and more spiritual. Like if I sat and believed that, I would actually be more kind of spiritual, a wiser person. And this is the phrase, no hay mal que por bien no venga, which literally means there is no such bad thing that doesn't come for a good reason. Or to put it, more English way, anything bad happens for a good reason. Which of course is total horseshit. But I understand it only now. In hindsight, I understand it, from the position of my research, from the position from after learning all that information that was hidden from me by the culture as I was growing up. And if you come to Puerto Rico, if you came to Puerto Rico, for example, in 2017, in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, because I very closely watched these events that were unfolding in Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico was this kind of special place for me. Growing up, when I assumed my Hispanic identity, I wanted to travel all around the Hispanic world, all over Latin America, and Puerto Rico was the first place where I wanted to come. So I watched the pictures of this beautiful island on my computer, and I literally dreamt of coming there. And that was the circumstances of my life never allowed me to go there or anywhere in Latin America. And then in 2017, I see how this island is being devastated by Hurricane Maria. And let me tell you, that was not just something personal for me, but I also watched how that was related to the subject of my study, the empathy and empathic failure in collective context. So, on the one hand, I saw the reports and the evidence and, of people who lost everything they had, who lost their homes, all their belongings. Some of them lost their family members because, there was no electricity. Hospitals couldn't work. And so if people were admitted to hospitals with some urgent issues during that period of hurricane, they could not be effectively treated. So there were so many tragedies happening. And that was quintessential trauma. A situation happening for no fault of people, natural disaster, and then absolutely directly threatening their survival and their basic human needs. And most painfully, when I was watching that kind of humanitarian crisis happening in Puerto Rico, I also saw many privileged Hispanics who lived in the US or other Western countries and who said, you know what, they either evacuated or they got what they needed, or they got what they deserved. Or some, Puerto Ricans who lived in the U.S. said, well, they could have moved to mainland U.S. Of course, Puerto Rico is such a shitty place to live. So there was such a flagrant lack of empathy, not just on the part of white people, not just on the part of the federal government, this pathetic response to that crisis, but even on the part of their fellow Hispanics. And so I think that if you came to this calamitous-stricken island in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and you told people who lost everything they had, pero sabes, no hay mal que por bien no venga, I think that would give you a finger. And they would be right. Because if you say, no hay mal que por bien no venga, that only means that real trauma has never happened to you. That you spent your entire life in a privileged bubble, completely out of touch with the experiences of people around you, and in blissful ignorance of your unearned advantages. And concluding this video, I want to share with y'all one real-life example of what rationalization of trauma might look like. So, this is the example from the relationship that I had with a talent agent from Hollywood. So I probably mentioned the story in my every other video because it is so illustrative. And this story just shows how flagrant and absurd rationalization of trauma may get and how it may still be served on the platter of spirituality by a privileged person. So he was a gay man, a Latino, working as a talent agent in Los Angeles, and he was originally from Venezuela. And the thing is that unlike modern day Venezuelans who are just fleeing the country that's fallen apart, he didn't have to look for the opportunity to find a job or to find a place to live outside his country. He moved quite a long ago. He moved to the U.S. at the age of 12 at the expense of his family because his grandparents already lived in Florida. So he didn't have to create, unlike, again, modern-day Venezuelans that are adult, he didn't have to create this kind of opportunity for himself to escape the country where he would be experiencing multilateral trauma just because of this ongoing economical and political crisis. After moving to the U.S. at the age of 12, so there's a bit of backstory about him as a person. After moving to the U.S. at the age of 12, his life in America turned out to be pretty fortunate. So he finished high school, then he went to college in Florida, then he moved to New York, where in his 20s he started representing photographers in the fashion industry. So there's a lot of stuff going on around this industry in New York. And so this is how he made connections with many influential people in the industry. And then he moved to Los Angeles, where he started representing photographers in Hollywood and also other types of artists in Hollywood, basically creating his own agency, representing talent. And so these days, in his 40s, he was enjoying this great life in Los Angeles, living in a nice house, driving a shiny black brand new Mercedes Benz, going to luxury resorts a few times a year, rubbing his shoulders with celebrities, dating some of those celebrities. And so basically I and that person we started communicating over a podcast that he started hosting in the beginning of 2018. That was a podcast about spirituality, mental growth, and creative innovation. And so, I believe that he was serious about those topics because those topics were very close to my heart. And so I started leaving comments on his posts, then we started communicating in Instagram DM, then we went on to FaceTime, WhatsApp, pretty much a regular way that this long distance relationships work. And, we were a few months into this kind of communication when he started framing it as a friendship. So he started calling me his friend. He started sharing with me some personal experiences that a healthy person would not share with anyone but a friend. He started really very plausibly practicing trust and vulnerability with me. And also treating me responsibly and kindly, despite this huge abyss of socioeconomic privilege that lay between me and him. Me, a poor guy trapped in a third world country, with his artistic work, with his talent, but not having any opportunity. And he, a fortunate guy living in Hollywood, rubbing his shoulders with celebrities, having lots of money, and lots of material goods, lots of opportunities. And so he started, treating me as a friend, as a long-distance friend. He told me things like how much he appreciated me and my empathy and my heart and my intelligence and, how he wanted to meet me in real life. And, all the things that were really plausible, that really made sense given what was going on in our communication. It's not that, I just bought into him blowing smoke out my ass. It's just that I was hustling for my self-worth, and then I, bought into some person giving me compliments. But he really behaved like a friend would behave. And so I really was eager to build friendship with him because he was intelligent. He looked to me very intelligent, very kind, and very, self-aware person. That's how he appeared to me. And so I proceeded with that friendship. And you know what? The thing that is absolutely true is the saying, a friend in need is a friend indeed. So when he had his emotional needs and we were talking, I was always here for him, making space for him, listening, giving empathy. Even though most of the time when we talked, he, didn't hesitate to wave his privilege in my face, to brag about his opportunities, the people that he dates, the people that he hangs out with, the people that he goes on luxury resorts with, and also the amount of money that, he gets from his projects, and, about, going to cosmetic surgeries. And that was really, that was hurtful on the one hand, but I thought, okay, maybe he just doesn't understand what life looks like for me. And so then I started reaching out and trying to tell him about my life experience here in Russia, this experience of life defined by trauma, poverty, oppression. And, there was it looked like he didn't take it seriously enough. It looked like he didn't want to get in touch with those experiences and just wanted to keep the conversation light and fun and easy. And, but I dismissed that. I thought, what, he professes so much about spirituality in his podcast and about empathy. So, I might just be mistaken. Maybe I just don't understand something. And then this point comes where I feel that we have built enough trust for me to open up about my book and to ask his help with my book. This creative project that deals with intersectional social justice for globally relevant social issues, homophobia, medical malpractice, corruption, and mental health stigma. So here's the thing. he had access to those exact people in the US who I needed to connect with and talk about my project in order to get it off the ground. Because I couldn't, I was the talent behind this project. I wrote this book, I envisioned the strategy for it, but I didn't have the resources, connections, and opportunities living in the place of oppression where I was in order to bring it to life and in order to allow it to serve the people that it was destined to serve. And so he had connections with those exact people who I couldn't connect to. He had access to them by virtue of his privilege. And I also thought, he was a gay man. Like, I was advocating for gay people in my work, and in my work around intersectional social justice in general, and with this book in particular. And so I still stuck to this really false and kind of misleading belief that just because my work addresses homophobia, gay people should be the first among those who are willing to help me. So, and he was a gay man, and I again bought into that myth. So I started talking to him about my work, from talking about homophobia and the urgency of fighting homophobia and heterosexism today. So basically, I shared with him a part of my research on homophobia, the research that backed up my novel. So that was the third part of critical awareness of homophobia, the data about the impact of homophobia and heterosexism in today's world. So, for example, I shared with him the data about concentration camps for gay men in Russia, the country where I live. So, this information somehow broke into the news 2 years ago, even though the majority of our media are government controlled. But this information somehow broke into the news that in this country, in a certain region of this country, we have special concentration camps, literally like in Nazi times. We have concentration camps built for gay men, and then we have special police officers who hunt for gay men on dating apps. Then they set up fake dates with those men. Then they kidnap those men, bring them to those concentration camps where those gay men are murdered, beaten, tortured, mutilated. And this happens, those concentration camps are built, and those police officers perpetrating those barbarities are receiving their salaries from taxpayers' money. My money included. So I'm among the people sponsoring this horrible, this barbarity, this homophobic violence, because of the kind of government that we have and the kind of culture that we have. And this is 21st century. This is the country that portrays itself as a democracy. And international organizations cannot do anything because the state covers up this homophobic violence. And I also know that the same happens in many countries in the world. And so I shared with him this part of my research, just illustrating how horrible the situation around homophobia is, still up to this day. So it's not confined in history. It's not about someone just giving you weird looks if you're gay, but it is about real violence happening. And so guess what he responds to that? He says, "Well, I think that if we're spiritual enough, we need to accept everybody's beliefs and their attitudes, including the beliefs and attitudes of those people who work in those concentration camps." So lo and behold, according to a gay man living in a nice house in West Hollywood and dating gay celebrities, we need to accept homophobic violence happening in Russia. We just need to accept that, because we need to be spiritual enough and accept everybody's beliefs and behaviors. So that is a very convenient position when you know that your individual ass is safe. When your individual ass sits on a couch in a chic living room in West Hollywood. When you're not the one who gets laid off, harassed, murdered, tortured, pulled over, when someone discovers that you're gay, when you're not the one whose house gets set on fire when your neighborhood sees you with your same-sex partner. So, how convenient is that? How cute is that? And I was just so stupefied by this kind of response that I couldn't call bullshit on it immediately. And I couldn't even just put an end to this conversation immediately, just understanding the true colors of that person that basically came out in this conversation, that being a gay man, he didn't give a shit about what was going on to people from his community that lived in other parts of the world just by accident, because he had no merit in the fact that he was in Los Angeles. And those people were in this oppressed region of Russia. But then, trying to kind of sustain this conversation, I thought, okay, maybe this example with homophobic violence is too triggering for him. Maybe he just imagines it and all this kind of graphic details. So instead, I gave him a more kind of moderate example from his own country, from the U.S. I started talking to him about homeless kids in the U.S. and the fact that almost one half of homeless teenagers living in the streets of major American cities are LGBTQ. So this is the disproportionate amount that we have among this particular demographic. Far bigger proportion than LGBT people in the general population. And so why do those teenagers become homeless? It's not because they lose their homes because their parents get killed in traffic accidents or because their parents go bankrupt. No, their own parents, their own families keep them out of their own homes when they discover that they're gay or trans. So isn't that quintessential trauma? When your own family just throws you out into the streets when it discovers who you are. And what does homelessness particularly mean at that age? Like, homelessness is trauma at any age, but particularly at that age, in teenage years, what does it mean? It means exclusion from education, with very, very probable exclusion from the workforce in the future. It means exposure to human trafficking, exposure to drugs, exposure to prostitution, crime. Like, in those most vulnerable and formative years, these kids' lives get broken by their own families. And, this is not a million years ago in a third world country. This is what America looks like today. And so, guess what he responds to that? He says, well, I think God sends these kids, this experience, for their spiritual enlightenment. So, how cute is that? How cute is that? When you're sitting in a chic living room in West Hollywood, when you're not the one who picks up food from garbage trucks, like people in your native country do these days, when you are just about to hop into your brand new Mercedes-Benz to go to a luxury gym in order to make your body yet hotter than it is, yet more buffed and yet hotter, so you can measure up with your other fortunate gay friends that you go on vacations with for Thanksgiving or summer or whatever that is. When your only worries in life is that you didn't get $60,000 from that project, that you didn't marry that celebrity that you were dating, when you go around having access to cosmetic surgeries. So how convenient is that to rationalize the trauma of people from your community? And so here's the thing, rationalization of trauma is not just what he did to LGBT people, to people that I advocate for with my word, but he also did it to me. He just played with my vulnerability. He absolutely denied the experiences that I shared with him, the experiences of poverty and classism and socioeconomic oppression. He just waved his privilege in my face talking about cosmetic surgeries, all the while knowing that I had a skin tumor that I couldn't get adequate treatment for in this country because of the kind of healthcare that we have, and because of my socioeconomic status I couldn't go abroad and get it in Europe, even though in Europe it would be a cheap and affordable surgery if I lived there, and if I lived there it would even be free for me. So he just played with my vulnerability for almost 1 year, knowing that I needed his help with my creative work, knowing that he had the privilege of being able to help, the privilege that very few people had. but he gaslighted me. He abused me emotionally, just bringing me closer, then pushing me further, just entertaining himself, with that power that he had in his position of privilege. Manipulated me into denying my lived experience, my sanity, the legitimacy of my work, my legitimacy as an artist. Because he would never be willing to help me. He just tried to erase my experience, to wiggle out of practicing his values, to wiggle out of helping me. So in my face he would say, "Oh Jorge, of course, I would love to help you." But the moment I started this conversation in a meaningful way, he would chicken out of it by rationalizing the trauma of people I advocate for and by rationalizing my aspects of trauma. And let me tell you, all of this abuse and gaslighting was happening not because I was weak and he was strong. No, this unhealthy dynamics of power in their relationship was created by random circumstances. He had privilege and I had disadvantage. He was the fortunate guy in Hollywood, having access to all those people that can help me with my work, the work that couldn't be got off the ground otherwise, but through connections and through access to those people. He had access to that. And I was a guy in a third world country, without a penny at his back, trapped in poverty, and, without access to healthcare, living in food insecurity, living without access to healthcare in the face of present health issues. So the difference between our lives, this abyss between our lives, was created by random circumstances. It was not because I was worse than him, but he used that privilege to abuse me, to hurt me, and to entertain himself with his power, just like so many narcissists do. And, the lesson that I made from that relationship, of course, I was the one who put an end on it, because the three things you never get in abusive relationships are clarity, compassion, and closure. So that person would never tell me, "No, I refuse to help you." But he would kind of still be polite, but still avoid this conversation, still lead it away, still make it fun, fast, and easy, but never go into anything meaningful and real. And so the lesson that I made is that when you see people indulgent in rationalization of trauma on a constant basis, like, on a regular basis, repeating this phrase, "No hay mal que por bien no venga," especially when that trauma is not happening to them, that should be a huge red flag for you, because that means that their tolerance for discomfort sucks, that their respect for truth sucks, and that their capacity for empathy sucks as a consequence. And empathy is the only platform upon which any meaningful help can be given. And so when people deny you empathy by rationalizing your trauma, it is a very convenient and very polite and very nice way to wiggle out of helping you without telling you that outright, without saying it in your face. Because when people don't acknowledge the reality of your trauma, they don't acknowledge the fact that you deserve to be helped, and that the system, the person or the place that traumatized you should be held accountable. And if you've been at the receiving end of rationalization of trauma for many years, just like I have been, and you took that bullshit in, just looking at those people who were in positions of power or privilege or formal authority, maybe it's because they were your parents, maybe it's because they were clergy, maybe they were your bosses or your university professors, but you shared with them your lived experience and they just rationalized the trauma that was happening to you. And just had, "Oh yeah, okay, I'm just so stupid, I don't understand that my trauma isn't really trauma, I should be, I'm not mature enough, I'm not smart enough, I should be, I should be wiser, I should understand that it is all happening for good reason." Because those people tell you that so that they could get away with sustaining the status quo, with not helping you, and with not changing things for you. So if that's been happening for long enough, you can actually get to the point where you start denying your own experience, your own lived experience, including the experience of trauma. And that is completely fatal. That is where addiction, depression, suicide start happening. Because the truth of your experience will not disappear. It shall not be denied. It will not be denied, no matter what kind of rhetoric is being used to deny it. But when you deny the truth, when you deny your experience, there is no way you can pick up a pen and write a different ending for it. That's the key. The key is about the power to write a different ending. That is what Brené Brown calls owning your story in her work. That is the courage to acknowledge the truth of what's happened and then rise strong from your traumatic experience and bring about a revolution in your life. And ultimately create the ending that your story deserves, instead of allowing your story to remain defined by your trauma, and instead of allowing yourself to remain a character trapped in the stories written by someone else, particularly those in positions of privilege. So there is no way you can reclaim that authorship and bring about a different ending unless you acknowledge the truth of what happened to you, no matter how traumatic and uncomfortable that is. So you have to be crystal clear about the truth of your experience and never negotiate it with anyone, even if no one around you acknowledges it, because of their cowardice, because of their privilege, because of their shame, and most importantly, because of their need for comfort. So I do hope you take this story and this message constructively. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for tuning in and being with me. I do hope you will be able to spot rationalization of trauma next time you hear it. And I also hope you'll have the courage to come forward and call bullshit on it. Because it's our common responsibility to eliminate this kind of rhetoric from our culture in order to move towards social justice. In the comments below, please share with me some examples of rationalization of trauma that you observed in your life. Maybe in your personal relationships, in your social circles, in your community, maybe in church, maybe in politics, wherever. It is important that we talk about it so we could see the magnitude of that problem and then start addressing it effectively. Also, a gentle reminder here, if you're sharing some personal stories that involve trauma, please don't feel forced to share them in a way that might leave you feeling unnecessarily exposed. Just share to the extent you believe is appropriate. Because I know that sharing our stories of trauma can be very tough. Vulnerability is the greatest casualty of trauma. And especially if you've been denied empathy around your trauma, like I have been for the majority of my life. It is excruciatingly hard to share it, even with the people you've come to trust, never mind in public spaces like on this channel. But my suggestion here is that when we share our stories of trauma, we can share them in a contextual way, meaning that we zoom out of the particulars of our stories, of our individual circumstances that may leave us feeling exposed, unnecessarily exposed, and instead we focus on some large-scale patterns and some universally relatable examples and feelings that represent the essence of our experiences. So this is how we lead those conversations in contextual way, being curious and generous and empathetic with one another. And we need to keep having these conversations, the conversations about trauma and rationalization of trauma, in order to finally bring about more justice, more equality, and more prosperity in the world. So, thank you so much for watching, and if you find this video insightful, inspiring, or helpful, don't hesitate to share it with your friends. Also, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time on Jorge's YouTube channel. Keep telling the truth, be brave, show up, stay curious, and take care, guys. Bye.